Welcome back to Ecocriticism 101 and lecture number 15 and Rachel Carson. So Rachel Carson is our last author in the Western tradition. We will be jumping to Buddhism. That's going to be kind of an interesting jump to sort of draw attention to the Western tradition by way of it. But today and for the next lecture, we have Rachel Carson. So why we've dedicated 2 lectures to Carson and part of to Henry David Thoreau is they're just so important. And they also represent different eras of environmentalism. So, I mentioned Thoreau can be seen as sort of the first emergence of environmentalism, environmental ethic in the United States. The second one will emerge in the 1960s, really. Rachel Carson is the beginning of that decade. It's a milestone work. We're going to talk about how well read it was, how influential it was, but it's actually part of a cluster of things that will happen there. So Carson is going to call for legislation to ban a particular pesticide, which he calls biocides. I'll talk about that distinction in a few minutes, called DDT. But a whole range of things will come under examination, scrutiny, and ultimately legislation in the 1960s. So you'll have in that decade the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and that will all sort of culminate in the early 1970s with the formation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And that really inaugurates sort of modern environmental legislation regarding the environment in the U.S. But Carson is responsible for what I would call really a sea change of attitudes. Other things are causing that too, and a very important one we shouldn't forget, given that this course is being taught at the University of California at Santa Barbara, was the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969, which was, up until that point in time, the largest oil spill in U.S. history. And aside from being just a large oil spill, it really mobilized people in a decade where people were generally getting mobilized. So what I mean by that, of course, there were large-scale anti-war protests in the 1960s, and it's probably not surprising that when the oil spill happened, there were, large-scale protests against it, and, people were just sort of mortified at what was happening to the environment, and that just really brought it home. Other things as well, but people will often, and I'm not just saying this as a resident of Santa Barbara, but people will often see that as a milestone event in bringing about the modern environmental movement. And that's really what we have here, and that is the modern environmental movement being inaugurated with Rachel Carson. It's a point where a lot of courses like this may have actually started, in that, you could, if you just wanted to get to modernity and, the last few decades, last 6 or 7 decades, you could have started someplace like this, maybe go back a little earlier into the 50s or so. But certainly, if you're talking about this modern environmental movement, it definitely would have been post-World War II. And really, Carson would be the big public kickoff of it. But I wanted to, with this course, do something different insofar as to give you the background for that. So we're going to be seeing things, again, as we did with Thoreau, that you're already aware of that would influence Rachel Carson. So one thing, for example, would be pastoral. How is Rachel Carson in the pastoral tradition? You may not think of her that way. She's not like a pastoral poet or something, but she clearly is in that tradition. So let's jump right into the Prezi. And here we are, and notice how high up we are here, that we are at the very end time-wise. We're almost, where we are in the 21st century, and we have also moved all the way into the United States now, which we had already done with Thoreau. So Carson, here's a quote from Carson. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe around us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. So Carson has a number of wonderful, pithy little aphorisms like this, sort of, spread out through the work. But it this quote does reveal that she really, comes about in a certain era. So I mentioned that, if we go back 400 years, people, their impression of wilderness, the natural world, not necessarily great. I mean, fearful of it, suspicious of it, and sort of the world being the source of sin and things like that. But by the time we get to, the Romantic poets and Thoreau, we're seeing a change in that attitude. We're seeing people of the impression that, nature is good, nature is wonderful. And Carson is born into that era and leverages that too, that, this is a wonderful, world around us. We should appreciate it. And the more we appreciate it, the less taste we would have for its destruction. And it makes sense, right? Why would you want to save something that you really don't care much about? You're not going to work to preserve, a landfill or something. You just wouldn't, you think that's a pretty nasty place. Why would you want to preserve something like that? But if you have, after generation and generation, come to really appreciate wilderness and nature, that you may want to do just what Carson is calling for, which is help preserve it. So let's have a little background on Rachel Carson. These are her dates. Carson, to be very clear here, she is principally a journalist. That's not to say she doesn't have a background in science. In fact, she has an MA in zoology from Johns Hopkins. And for a number of decades, principally her career was, working for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. And she produced pamphlets and articles on things like, fish populations and things like that. She gave up her job in 1952 to become a full-time writer because, she had written 3 award-winning books, and the one is called The Sea Around Us, and it's a very influential and important book in its own right. And it shows what Rachel Carson is about. So on the one hand, she understands science with a master's in zoology, not surprisingly. She's not a research scientist herself, and people sort of portray her that way, but it's incorrect. But what she really is, in addition to someone understanding science, is a really good writer. She has honed her skill for decades, and she has, knows how to write a book that people want to read. And Silent Spring will be a book that people want to read and do read. So it's interesting because we've seen this before, and I've mentioned, if you look at, say, the most influential environmentalists after Rachel Carson, people like Bill McKibben, Al Gore, these are not scientists. They may be aware of science and certainly are respectful of it, but they first and foremost are communicators. And that's what Rachel Carson is, a communicator more than anything else. Unfortunately, as you may imagine, when Rachel Carson came out with Silent Spring, which would be attacking the pesticide industry, she was attacked for it. And a number of the ways that she was attacked was, they repeatedly questioned her scientific credentials. In other words, she didn't have a PhD. She wasn't a research scientist. What did she know about any of this? They repeatedly attack her because she's a woman. So, you will hear her called again and again, Miss Carson, Miss Carson, Miss Carson. And, it's to draw attention to the fact that we're not talking about Dr. or Professor Carson here. And the Miss thing is another, really nasty aspect of this whole business of the attack, because at the time they were drawing attention to not only that she was a woman, but a single woman, an older single woman, and believe it or not, they came right out and intimated, well, she's probably lesbian then, and that was part of the attack on her. So very nasty business, and kind of relentless at the time, though, because, and you'll see this, I teach courses in like climate change denial literature and all. So often you will have a switch from an attack on the science or a discussion of the science, which is really what is called for with the climate crisis and with Carson and with pesticides, but a shift to the attack on the scientists directly. And it was then 70 years ago and is now deplorable, in my opinion. Yeah, this hasn't relented over the last few decades. Carson is still attacked. So, you have a chemical industry spokesman here in the 21st century arguing if man were to follow the teachings of, and again, Miss Carson, we would return to the dark ages and insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. Yeah. So this is it's just part of it with Carson. And you would think that since Silent Spring is this milestone text that, everyone acknowledges now inaugurated the modern environmental era, then they would have relented. But no, and I'll give you other examples during the lecture today and for the next one as well. Carson did die of cancer in 1964. We don't know if it's in any way related to pesticides. Probably not, I would suggest, in that she didn't directly work with them. She's not a research scientist. It's not like she had them in her lab or something like that. But she lived long enough to actually testify to Congress and saw the influence that Silent Spring was having. So Silent Spring, the book itself, 1962, it helped spawn the modern environmental movement. As we know, human beings in different ways have been preoccupied with their environment, for as long as human beings have been, thinking and writing about it, and in the West, certainly for thousands of years. But it really became a widespread movement in the 1960s in the U.S. That's when the modern environmental movement begins. And in some sense, you could argue that Rachel Carson, Silent Spring sort of bookends one end of it, the beginning of that decade, and the Santa Barbara oil spill brings about this is the second bookend at the end of the decade. Obviously, things will continue on in the 1970s and to today, fortunately, with environmental activists and all. But it is interesting to think about how Carson began to mobilize people, got them thinking about the problem, wanting to do something about it. And by the end of that decade, people, by the thousands will turn out to protest what's happening environmentally in the U.S. Yeah. So an important thing here, and we're still seeing the legacy of this today, and it's a good thing, but it has a downside too. Poets have been skeptical of science for centuries and all, but the general public, if you were to look at the sentiment in the 1950s, there was often an embrace of, new modern technology, new modern conveniences, new modern breakthroughs. The public was sort of, on board for what science could do. And with things like new chemicals, the sort of new chemicals that can make, clothing and all, things like nylon, but then chemicals like pesticides and all that. It was sort of a naive period, one might say, in that it was a naive faith in science. People just thought, well, science can do this. We should trust science. And, that's a good thing. But on the other hand, we're not really talking about science here with something like DDT as much as we're talking about an industry. And what we have then is a shift away from, a blind faith in what science can do, and especially what industry might be peddling us. That's a good thing. I mean, it's good to be critical. It's good not to, to just believe whatever companies or even the government is saying if, you want to get to the root of what it is. But on the other hand, it's part of, I could go back to really the debate over creationism in the United States and all, a general suspicion of science. And again, being critical of science is good, but a suspicion of it, when that goes into something like, the anti-vax movement, vaccine movement, especially as it sort of reemerged in a huge way during COVID, that's a little problematic, So it's good not to blanketly, accept everything the science has to say, but on the other hand, when the scientific community is getting behind something rather than like a particular industry, and things have been carefully peer reviewed and the scientists are speaking collectively to the public, I think we need to, to listen to what they say. So Carson is, though, partly responsible for the shift away from that. It's, one thing to realize is that Carson is interested in one particular chemical primarily, which is DDT. By extension, a range of other pesticides, which we'll call biocides as well, but principally that. So, she's not interested in other chemicals that we may have around us. But by the 1970s and the 60s really, but then into the 70s as well, into today, people will then become more concerned about other things. So, for example, additives in food. What is it that we're actually ingesting? So it's one thing we're spraying DDT everywhere, but on the other hand, when you go to the supermarket, the range of chemical preservatives and all that you're ingesting right in your body. People become, again, because of this lack of credibility of industry, in particular science, kind of by extension, people will really get on board for that. And all sorts of environmental issues in particular, like the nuclear protests of the 1970s and all, and with 3 Mile Island in the late 1970s, will really cut that industry off because of this popular swelling of support for the anti-nuke movement at the time. So Carson, again, I wouldn't characterize her as a general purpose environmentalist, if they're, in the sense of someone broadly concerned about a lot of issues, but rather she's keeping a very tight focus on one issue. And I'll talk about it. That's a great strategy, actually, because this was an issue that could actually be solved, and it was solved within like a decade of Silent Spring coming out, and that was by banning DDT in the United States. So it's a good strategy that way, but just to clarify, she's not sort of, generally looking at environmental issues. So Communicator, and this is important because this is what Rachel Carson does and is. Because she has all this experience writing for the public, she was able to put things in very simple terms. And what she actually did is, first, to be very clear, she didn't do the research herself. She's not a research scientist. She's mainly a journalist. But her scientific background, with a master's degree in zoology, she was able to read the work of other scientists. So what she did, her job, was to sort of amass all of the scientific papers on DDT and other pesticides and read through them and understand them, and then think, well, how do you translate that to something that the public will understand? Because that's pretty hard, right? I think very few of us would want to sit down and read scientific papers to try to understand something that is one of the many things we have to try to understand in life. But Carson did that, and that again is her wonderful sort of two-pronged strength. She understood the science, but then with all these decades of writing, she was able to communicate it in a way that made sense to the public, and that was no small deal to do. Yep. So you could look at Carson as sort of the beginning of, eco-journalists. And again, eco-journalists are very influential. So I give the example here of Michael Pollan, but Bill McKibben, for example, will write a book in the late 1980s talking about the climate crisis and why we need to be alert to the problem. And, there had been people talking about it before. Certainly, James Hansen, right at that time, is actually talking to Congress about it and the sort of front page news. But it's someone like McKibben who can really put it together and put everything in one place, a book where people can read about it and learn about the climate crisis. So his book is a milestone because it alerted the nation, the United States, and the world that, something very important was happening here. Someone else would be like, Michael Pollan, who's able to do the same. All these people, so Michael Pollan and Bill McKibben are both, for example, journalists for The New Yorker for quite a while, and it's there that they sort of learn their trade of communicating to the public. But Al Gore is another great example of a communicator. I mean, yes, Al Gore is a politician, but with films like An Inconvenient Truth and Inconvenient Sequel, he really takes on the job of communicating to the public directly. But again, these are not scientists; they're communicators, but they're very good communicators. So Carson is interesting because at times she unabashedly romanticizes the environment. So very much like Thoreau. Thoreau wants to get us to imagine what life at Walden Pond is like, and he really romanticizes it, sort of over-the-top portrayal of how wonderful it is. Carson does the same. It's how wonderful the earth is and all. But she also, and this is a tricky thing to do, because you could imagine if you went too far that way, you'd kind of lose your credibility, because this person is just, like a poet celebrating the earth right and left. On the other hand, Silent Spring is also clearly written by someone with scientific sensibilities, a scientist, and there's this sort of cool, calm, dejected view, holding everything at a little distance. So yes, we can celebrate, the earth or whatever in particular, but we also need to look carefully at what's going on, how things work here and all. And only a scientist can do that. So her two-pronged, skills, being both a scientist and a communicator, are both on display. And I think she does a wonderful job of balancing the two. Although some people have argued, especially in the 21st century, that maybe it could have been a little less emotional in the writing, a little, just stay with the science. I don't know. That's a question I'll put to you, because I think there's a strong argument to be made for why sort of appealing to the emotions and the heart is also effective here. Yep. So Carson cultivated her public image, and she was very careful of her, I guess what we'd call her brand today, as both a scientist and a naturalist. So let me exemplify this here. So this is Rachel Carson working at a microscope, presumably looking at something. This is Rachel Carson out top of a mountain somewhere. Yeah, neither of those really represent who Rachel Carson was. And they're kind of misleading, in fact, because Rachel Carson did not work with microscopes. Rachel Carson, again, was not a research scientist. And Rachel Carson isn't out. Her work doesn't take her outside to be a naturalist like that. It's not that she's actually going out and looking at what's happening and the impact of DDT. If we were to have an accurate representation of what Rachel Carson did and all, it would be her sitting at a desk at the time, not with a computer, but with a typewriter, and a stack of scientific papers and journals and around her. That's what she did. That's where she worked. Her work was desk work. Nothing wrong with that. That's what I do all day long. But it's not this. But again, to the American public, I don't know that would have been an image of her sitting at a desk wouldn't have communicated exactly what she did, I think, very successfully. So you have people following this. So I think it's Silent Spring is an important milestone text in terms of the environmental movement and communicating, this issue. But it also set a model for people who will come after that. People like Al Gore, Michael Pollan, Bill McKibben. They romantically sort of tug at the heartstrings. We'll actually talk about how Gore does that in a few minutes. But they also want to lay out the science for it. So Al Gore will start an Inconvenient Truth talking about a river and how beautiful and wonderful it is. That's the film version. And then he'll later be showing, a PowerPoint presentation of all sorts of graphs showing, the increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, the so-called hockey stick graph and all. So it's, to one hand, make this understandable, to sort of pull you in emotionally, but then to sort of, hand feed you the science and all. Some people have attacked Carson for this rhetorical approach because instead of just laying out the science, they're arguing that she's sort of manipulating the emotions of people. But and you could say the same of Gore and McKibben or any of them. But I would argue that if you're trying to engage the public, with this issue, you really want to get them to care. And Carson is going to employ some of the techniques that we've been seeing developing for thousands of years to do that. Yep. She, is writing in a scientific way, but one of the strengths of Carson is that she avoids jargon. So if you were to read through all those scientific articles and journals and all, you'd find yourself way down in a lot of technical jargon, a lot of formulas and things like that. If you didn't do that, the arguments would get lost, right? I mean, you wouldn't, the audience wouldn't even know what you were talking about with jargon. So it's a formidable task, right? Because the reason that scientists come up with the jargon to begin with, specific terminology, is to communicate back and forth with each other, and it's can be very dense and effective way of doing it. But Carson has the job of like translating all of this, to a general audience. An Inconvenient Truth has the same thing. You can use graphs, but you have to be careful how much you use. You can use formulas, but you don't want to use a lot. But you do need that. So it's a real job in itself, and it makes clear why this is such an important profession. So people often ask me, because I have like large courses also on the climate crisis about, what can someone do if they want to do something about the climate crisis? And the first things that come to mind is maybe it'd be like a research scientist trying to understand the crisis, or a technology person working on like the next generation of lithium-ion batteries or something. But it's very clear to me that, all fields are required. Pretty much anything you could think of is important now with something as big as the climate crisis to make an intervention. And something like being a writer, communicator, filmmaker, these are incredibly important professions, and difficult to do, but when done right are just amazing in the amount of impact they can have in the world. So both Carson and Gore, they make clear the real power of rhetoric and language here. So as communicators, what their stock and trade is rhetoric. And we've seen effective writing throughout the term here, and you can help even bring about an environmental consciousness. It's something of Virgil's first eclogue. He's trying, Melibellus is trying to make Tityrus, and by extension Virgil is trying to make us, the readers, aware of the importance of the environment. Ben Jonson is doing the same when he's concerned about the encroachment into London suburbs in the 17th century, early 17th century. They're really attempting to bring about something, Virgil and Johnson, like an environmental consciousness. Gore and Carson are trying to do the same thing, but to a real mass market. And I'll talk in a moment about how influential the book was, Silent Spring, and Gore's film was I think it's not one of the top 10 biggest grossing documentaries ever, but last I checked it was number 11. So they're both very influential, but it's a real challenge they have, because they're attempting to bring about an environmental consciousness in the reader or viewer in this case, as was Virgil and Ben Jonson. So it's not a new challenge, but it's still a big one in the 20th century. This slide shouldn't be here. Sorry, that was left over from way back the beginning of the term. If we look at Silent Spring directly, you can see Carson's considerable rhetorical skills on display here. And maybe the best example of all is the title Silent Spring, which is actually referencing a poem by Keats, and is talking about a time where everything had died in this poem, and there was a silent spring. So why is it a silent spring? First, it has that nice little alliteration there with the S and S. But why is it a silent spring? It's because all the animals had been killed, but specifically all the birds have been killed. So if you go out on a nice spring morning, and close your eyes, what you'll hear, if you're out even not in a wilderness area, just like in a neighborhood like mine, you'll hear the songs of birds, and that sort of characterizes spring. If you could actually say, well, what's the representative sound of spring, and that would be it. But Carson is saying, but there are no more birds. Something has happened. Why are the birds all dead? So that's what the title is. It's like saying there are dead. All the birds have died. You could have called it that, right? All the birds have died. But instead, she uses this wonderful image and sort of forces you to unpack it. And she'll do that for you. So it's not like you need me to tell you that. She'll tell you why it's a silent spring, and she does that within the first 3 pages. But it's a very clever title, and again, it's not something like what a scientist would do about the impact of DDT on bird populations or something. This wouldn't cut it. Carson is more of a communicator than that. If she really wants to communicate something effectively and tug at your heartstrings effectively, she's very clever. She doesn't do it herself. So she writes here about a, quote, housewife, which is the way you would have described women working at home at the time, who wrote to her saying, quote, "It's hard to explain to the children that the birds have been killed off. Is there anything being done? Can anything be done? Can I do anything?" Wonderfully clever here, right? So on the one hand, instead of sort of being emotional herself and taking that position, I think that for Carson, who wants to stay at some distance as an objective scientist on it, she's not going to want to take that position. I'm not saying she didn't actually receive this letter. Maybe she did, or maybe she didn't. If she didn't, let's just say this is very well constructed, and if she did, it's very well chosen to include here, because how do you explain to the children, right? So that puts a whole different balance on things when you say to explain to children, how the birds have been killed off, why it's done. But then, and note here, we're right around page 100 in the book. At this point, this person here is not so much speaking for Carson. Obviously she is, but speaking for the reader too, because at this point, if you've read all, up to this and you've gotten what she's saying, this is about where she wants you to be. In other words, you should be like mortified. Well, how am I supposed to explain this to my children, what's going on here? And then she hopes that you will express the rest of it, the attitude that you yourself are mobilized. Is anything being done? What's being done about all this? Can anything be done? And then the real kicker here, can I do anything? Has she mobilized you? Has she gotten you into this position? She's actually, demonstrating the position in the text itself where she wants you to be. She wants you to be upset, angry, concerned, trying to figure out what can be done, and then figuring out, well, what can I do? And, that for any activist text, but say any environmentalist text in particular, say it's on the climate crisis, if you read through it, hopefully you will at some point take this attitude, take this position that, you're frustrated, you want to do something, you want something to be done, and then can I actually be one of the people who does something? So very clever putting it in there that way. Very useful to look at how she uses specific words. So insecticides is still the word that we use today, but that's actually a loaded term coming out of the industry that produces insecticides. And it's the notion that these chemicals are very single purpose, that they just kill insects, that they're sort of like little guided missiles that do just that and don't, there's no other damage. Carson rejects it. She sees that as basically like a propaganda term. Instead, she uses the term biocide. Why bio? Well, bio, is Greek for life. What are these things? And, side is for death, like, homicide or something. So what do these things really do? Yes, they kill insects, but they kill life more generally, and that should worry us, because they'll kill insects, but they're also killing birds as well, and animals, and ultimately impacting and contributing to the death of human beings. So it's very clever what she's done there, because she's just not buying into the terms that the discussion is framed in, which is being framed by the industry itself, and she's rejecting it. And unfortunately, all these years later, her term didn't catch on. I think if it did, just if that one shift had happened by way of Rachel Carson for the public, so that every time you went to a nursery, a plant nursery, and you decided to buy something to kill insects, if it didn't say insecticide, if it said biocide on it, I think people might think a little differently about it, hopefully. She also draws attention to the fact that, and this is a clever move and a really damning one with respect to this industry, that insecticides were developed during the Second World War. These chemicals were developed not as insecticides, but as biocides. So, in other words, these were developed for chemical warfare, for human beings to deploy against human beings. These were designed to kill human beings. However, you're in the laboratory, you need to test them. I guess we always think of testing on animals like mice and all. But as Carson draws attention to the fact that, insects were used as well to test them. And, if it killed insects, then it would, as a biocide, then it would likely kill, animals and human beings as well. So these are really chemical weapons designed to kill human beings. But the industry has sort of, wants us to forget about that and isn't telling us that's why they're really there. And it also reveals kind of how the industry works. So, you develop this biocide and it's really great, and maybe it'll get deployed in the war. Fortunately, in the Second World War, we weren't using chemical weapons like that, at least that way. But it also presents a problem for the industry. They went to all the trouble to create this chemical, and now it's, there's no use for it. But they realized from the experiments that it killed insects. So, wait, we have a product here that we could sell, not to the military to kill other human beings, but to people to kill insects. More good rhetoric on Carson's part. As the habit of killing grows, the resort to eradicating any creature may annoy or inconvenience us grows with it. So right off the bat, so we're not talking about as the habit of spraying insecticides increases. No, as the habit of killing grows. So we really need to she's really underscoring what we're doing here. We're killing. We're becoming, inert killers. We're becoming used to the idea of killing. And maybe, it starts with something like, let's kill an insect like mosquitoes that can transmit diseases like malaria. But then, hey, flies, boy, they're annoying, if you go outside for a picnic, there are flies everywhere. Wouldn't it be great if you could kill them too? And just get a little, spray can to do it, which of course you can now. And more generally, though, she's underscoring any creature here. So, once we resolve to kill, and once we become, accomplished killers, then why don't we just kill anything, any, kind of animal that bothers us? Why not? And again, in the tradition we're coming out of, the Western tradition, it's not like life is thought of as necessarily coming out of the tradition as sacred and all the way it would be in other religious traditions, like the Hindu religion, for example. No, it's not. And Carson says, well, and the problem is we could just become accomplished inert killers. Another great question. So we're here. You didn't read all these, by the way, but I just sort of got them throughout the text to kind of let you know where the text is going if you wanted to, now that you own a copy, if you want to finish reading it. Who has made the decision that sets into motion these chains of poisoning, the ever-widening wave of death that spreads out like ripples when a pebble is dropped in a still pond? Okay, first, good writing. I mean, it's creating an image here of this as sort of ripples going out on a pond. The language is charged here. The chains of poisoning. So again, it's not like the spraying of the insecticide. But no, what is this? This is killing. This is chains of poisoning. But then the real question she's asking here is the thing that she wants you to ask, who's made this decision to put this into motion? We didn't do it. The public didn't do it. We weren't asked about it. We didn't vote on this. Who's made these decisions, and how are they making them, and why are they being allowed to make them? Why wasn't the public asked about this? Why didn't you have to, vote on a referendum to let this happen? And she really wants to draw attention to the fact that there's a lot that's being done kind of behind the scenes with government and industry of which we're not aware. She wants to both make us aware, and she wants us to participate in this to stop it. As man proceeds toward his announced goal of the conquest of nature. So that's kind of a reference back to Genesis, right? We have dominion over the planet, and Rachel Carson's take on it is now we're trying to implement that, worldwide, planet-wide. So before we might have had the right to do it, depending on how you interpret the Genesis text. But now the issue is we're going to do it on this planet. We're going to take over this planet. We're going to conquer this planet. We're going to have complete, total dominion over this planet, which is arguably squarely on the mark, is what we did. But what has this done? He, meaning man, the male pronoun here. And I think, the Carson is obviously before a time where that was an issue. Pronouns are even, so in other words, saying, humankind rather than man here. But I think, there is something to be said for this as being kind of a patriarchal project, which is beyond the scope of our discussion, but I think it's right. He has written a depressing record of destruction, directed not only against the earth he inhabits, but against the life that shares it with him. So what is this project of, getting complete conquest, dominion over nature? It's a depressing record of destruction. We're destroying the planet itself, in the sense that, now we coming around in her era, but now, we destroy whole mountains. We literally, mountaintop removal, we cut them off to get the fossil fuels in there. We strip whole forests and all, like with the Alberta tar sands and elsewhere. So it's against the earth itself, this destruction, but it's against the life that shares this planet with us. And now that it is never clearer now. It's even more clear now than it was in Rachel Carson's time. We're in the middle of a sixth extinction, right? The last great extinction was 66 million years ago. With the dinosaurs, where 75% of life on Earth was destroyed. Now we're in the middle of the sixth extinction event, where maybe even more life on the planet is going to be destroyed. So this conquest of nature, we're doing it, but it has a horrible, horrible dark side to it. If you hadn't bought the argument that we should do this not to harm the planet, and we should do it so we don't hurt other animals and other insects and all, she hits you with another argument that might just get you, if you're that mind, on board. The fact is that every meal that we eat carries a load of chlorinated hydrocarbons. That's the inevitable consequence of almost universal spraying or dusting of agricultural crops with these poisons. So if you don't care about the earth, you don't care about other animals, you don't care about any of it, well, hey, the food that you're eating has all been sprayed with this stuff. So if you're not concerned about how these biocides, these chemical weapons, are harming animals, maybe you should think a little bit about what it's doing to you, because you're ingesting these poisons yourself. And it's a great argument. It's a very anthropocentric, it's an appeal to anthropocentrism, an appeal to just caring about human beings, or just caring about a particular human being, yourself. But you can see where it would be very effective for a certain reader. Yeah. Our line of defense against invading poisons or poisons from within is now weakening and crumbling. So here's the question, who made the decision to deploy this stuff? Who is spraying it everywhere? The stuff that we're eating, that, it's poison from within. It's now the stuff, we're ingesting is now weakening and crumbling. So, this is very much battle imagery, right? Line of defense, who's protecting us from these chemicals and the people who are spreading them. Well, that's crumbling and weakened now. We're not being protected by them. So it really is here a call to arms. In other words, this is a fight, people. If you didn't know it, it's a fight. We're being attacked. They're using chemical weapons. We're ingesting them. And now we have to stop this. We have to fight. We have to get together and fight it. I mean, I'm not saying you have to do acts of eco-terrorism. Rachel Carson would never suggest that, I'm sure. But we do need to go ahead and get together, become activists, make enough fuss so that the government will intervene and stop this. So, we will win this battle. And we did win this battle against DDT. So Carson is Communicator. Continue with it. Yeah. So Carson is very much aware, and this is in a way that I think it was a milestone for her. She's aware that we've inherited this belief of what is natural and what is not. So we've seen this, right, from the very beginning of class with the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a distinction between the natural and the artificial. In terms of that epic, what was inside the walls and what was out. If you remember back then, what was inside the wall, culture, all those cultivated gardens and all was good. What was outside, roaming wild animals and all was bad. So, but as early as really Theocritus, with the birth of modern Pastoral, that binary structure is still in place, the natural and the culture and the cultivated, but a switch in value occurs, so that now we value what's outside. So Pastoral is all about a celebration of the countryside outside of the city. It's an urban form, but the cultivated is not being preferred there. It's just the opposite. So Carson is very clever here because she's able to turn public opinion against these chemicals as being unnatural. So I keep using the word cultivated, but it means human constructed, right? So we may use chemicals all the time. We eat food, composed of glucose and lactose and all sorts of chemicals. That's fine because those, are natural. They haven't really changed much. I mean, we can change them through genetic modification, hybridization, and all that. But for the most part, they're natural. What Carson wants to do is, she knows that because ever since Theocritus, prefer the natural, prefer the pastoral, the beautiful, over the urban thing. But she wants to switch that to be a general skepticism and dislike of these chemicals as unnatural. And again, this is a real milestone because, industry had been telling us, well, get these new, all through the 50s, look at advertisements or anything. Here's this new chemical that you can use in your kitchen and it'll clean your countertop, cleaner than anything that you could use. So, for thousands of years, people use things like vinegar, which is very effective at cleaning your house and cheap and very safe. But suddenly, no, you have to buy these chemicals. You have to buy this whole range of chemicals. It's a very effective project, by the way. If you don't believe me, go into any supermarket, you'll see, an aisle half filled with these chemicals that we, should want to use. And people bought into it because, they stopped using vinegar and things like that as old-fashioned, and they started using these chemicals. Carson really is one of the first people who says, yeah, those are all unnatural. They're not natural like vinegar or something. And as a consequence, they're potentially very dangerous. And, if you care about the natural and you've been brought up to see natural as good, and things messed with by human beings is potentially bad. Why aren't you worried about these chemicals? DDT is her prime example, but lots of people will look at other chemicals that we use and we ingest, and the FDA will, although it had been around before, will really step up its work in the 1960s and 70s, even as the EPA comes on board in the same kind of way. So it's very clever, and we've inherited this, not this binary structure of natural and unnatural and preferring the natural. Sure, that's been around since Theocritus, and we've seen many examples of it. But this notion that these products are unnatural is something that has really gotten burned into us, right? You walk into a store, what do you want to get? You want to get as natural a product as you can. And there are even ways of, quantifying that you get an organic product, which is, we know then that doesn't have pesticides or herbicides used on it and all. So we've really bought into this notion, and I think, we just assume it's the right thing, but it's really, I think Carson is a milestone thinker here in getting us to change the way that we think about that. And so whenever you go into a store and you prefer anything, and it doesn't have to be something you eat, it could be a natural fabric, you want natural fabrics rather than artificial ones. Rachel Carson is sort of back there in that thinking and help consolidate that view. Really influential person. So she inherits the natural, unnatural dyad, but then popularized it. We might get the impression, though, and it makes sense, I guess, is that, everything prior to the era that Carson is intervening in, like the post-Second World War era, 1950s, are increasing love of chemicals and unnatural things. We might assume that everything that was before was natural, that before you had all these sprays to clean your house and all different kinds, that, everyone just used natural things like vinegar and all. Human beings had in a great way modified their environment before that. By the Second World War, there had been massive modifications to landscapes, obviously, with cities and all that. But certainly, substances had been developed and used for centuries. So we might want to think in a very pastoral way that, like, prior to Carson's era, everything was natural and everything was fine and everything was, in balance in nature and all. Well, it wasn't. I mean, there were great imbalances, the way people were living and taxing resources, and hey, with like deforestation, we'd actually had modified the environment. So if you buy into that thinking, again, you'll think that like rolling hills with sheep on them is a very natural thing. When they're not natural at all, that shows the sign of human intervention. That's a cultivated space. It's what we call a built environment. So that's been going on for a long, long time. But Carson is so effective at it, it kind of makes you think it's her era that makes the shift. Silent Spring definitely shifted environmental interest toward toxicity and poison. So we had seen, obviously, when I was just talking about like deforestation, that's been around in the West forever and all. But Carson made the public aware of something different, and that is the widespread use of toxic chemicals. And again, hers is a very specific study, which is in DDT, actually a specific biocide or pesticide. But once she gets that ball rolling, it makes total sense that other people will look at other chemicals, whether if it's not a pesticide, whether it's maybe a herbicide, what's going on with that. And these are things sprayed also on crops, but not to kill insects, but to kill other plants and so-called weeds. But more than that, food additives, what's in the paint that you're using, what's in all sorts of products that come into our world, including, what's in those cleaners that you're using in your kitchen and around the house. And that wouldn't be Carson's project, and she doesn't do that, but you can see why, once alerted to the danger of having brought these chemicals into our world and even into our homes, people would become very focused on them. And Carson really sort of, gets the ball rolling, but then will snowball into a range of other things. But Carson, though, is very clever here, I would argue, in that she keeps her focus on one particular problem. So you can see Al Gore doing the same thing. You could talk about a whole range of environmental problems that we have right now. So let's talk about Al Gore for a moment. And there's a lot with point source pollution, things like microplastics in the environment, and any number of chemicals and all that are being introduced, loss of habitat, the extinction event that's ongoing now that I'm talking about. You could talk about all that. But Al Gore keeps his focus on one issue, which is the climate crisis. And why? Because he wants exactly what Rachel Carson was able to ultimately get. It happened after she died, but he wants legislation to reel this in. He wants us to be aware of the problem. He wants us to work toward a solution as activists, but that's what he wants. He wants that problem to be addressed. And why? The same with Rachel Carson. So all those things I talked about, like additives in food or in chemicals and household cleaners and all, Carson could have talked about all that. And, the takeaway from it would have been that you would have been overwhelmed. I mean, Al Gore overwhelms people enough anyhow because the climate crisis is so big. But what Carson does is she keeps laser-like focus on this one issue. And it's brilliant, I think, as a maneuver, because I think she knew that if we acted, we could solve this one issue. If nothing else, we would get this big pesticide, DDT, banned. And it was. In 10 years, it would be banned in the United States. Not in the world, but in the United States. And I think the psychological impact of that, of having this environmental triumph, of proving at the very beginning of this environmental era where we want to act on cleaning up the planet, that we could actually do something effective, that we could do it. That instead of being this overwhelming mess of stuff that who knows where to begin or what to do, Carson would show we can do this. If we have to do it one by one, we can do it, but we can solve this problem. And that's, I think, a brilliant tactical move that I think energized generations of environmentalists, you've had a couple now, I guess, since her, that they could do something, that they could actually make a change in the world, that we just have to take these things maybe one at a time, but we can tackle them and we can move on. And I think that was a great move on her part, because just if Silent Spring had just made awareness of a whole range of problems, that's very different than solving them. And that's what she sets out to do. And so it's a very clever tactic to do so. Neither writer here, and just to be very clear, neither communicator, I guess I'd say, either Carson or Al Gore, talk about all sorts of other things, like I mentioned here, industrial runoff into rivers, the release of chemicals such as sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere when you burn fossil fuels. That creates both smog, like around freeways, and comes back to Earth as acid rain. Solid waste pollution and landfills is a huge issue today. Pollution of our oceans, you could go on and on and on and on. They don't address any of this. Neither of them are, generally speaking. I'm sure Al Gore has probably talked about solid waste pollution at some point, and I'm sure he finds it an important issue. But I think what they're trying to do, however, is to take on a problem and solve that particular problem. Now, the beauty of it is that there will be people coming after who will try to figure out how to solve the general problem. So, in other words, the Solid Waste Disposal Act in the 1960s will step in to try to deal with all solid waste disposal, or the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. Again, these are broad-ranging things. But for this type of environmental activism, I think to work with the general public, tackling a particular issue is a very effective strategy. So. There's a downside to it, though, and that is, Al Gore is keeping, for example, laser-like focus on one issue, which is, climate crisis, global warming. However, this is done at a great cost because, he has this opportunity to speak to the public, and and to communicate to the public what's going on, which he is, but for a lot of people, I think today, if you ask them about environmental issues, the go-to thing that they will say is the climate crisis, and that's great. It is arguably the most pressing thing right now, but we can't ignore the rest of what's going on, and it's often very much interrelated. So I mentioned something like sulfur dioxide. Well, that comes from burning fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels also releases CO2, which is the principal greenhouse gas. If you were to eliminate the burning of fossil fuels by shifting to an economy based on renewable energy, you would eliminate both of those problems, and more, because oceans can be polluted by, as we saw in 1969 in Santa Barbara, by oil spills and all. So you could tackle a number of things with this one issue, but I think from a rhetorical point of view, so as not to overwhelm the audience, the focus is held on specific things by both Carson and Gore. But the downside is people have argued, but what about like clean water? What about, microplastics? In our, obsession with focusing on the climate crisis as an environmental issue, we've, potentially ignored that. So it's an important point worth making. But again, I would argue that the good being done is, far outweighs that. Okay, so we're going to talk about right now Pastoral, and in the next lecture, I'm going to do some other things that will be familiar to us because, we've read about it before. So Pastoral, just noted a few minutes ago, sort of gets formally inaugurated by Theocritus, who's a Greek thinker. So Pastoral is very influential on Rachel Carson, or maybe another way of putting it, Rachel Carson really knows how to use Pastoral to influence people. So do Carson and Gore believe that human beings once lived in a perfect relationship with the planet? I don't know. But they both exploit the fact that we as readers, or as viewers, in the case of Gore's film, believe that. So what I mean by that is, we've seen, not just in the pastoral tradition, we see it in the Hebrew Bible, we see it in Hesiod, the notion that human beings believe that we once had a perfect relationship to the planet, an Edenic relationship. We actually lived in an Eden-like place called Eden, and that somehow that got lost. Well, Carson and Gore know we think that. Carson knows that we believe in the back of our mind that we once had this perfect relationship to the planet. So then the question is, what screwed it up? Well, on the biblical account, it's a serpent slipping into Eden. But here, it's another evil that comes on the scene. And Carson, and we'll talk about it in a moment, she's going to label that not as the serpent, but as DDT, playing the role of the serpent. And it's very clever because if you believe that a few decades ago or a few generations ago, the United States was this wonderful pastoral place with these beautiful farms and all, and something screwed everything up, then what did it? And Carson is going to tell you that in this particular case, and we'll get into her example, that DDT is what did it. So this is the opening to Silent Spring. This Fable for Tomorrow, the first 3 pages of Silent Spring, which you read, starts off, there was once a town in the heart of rural America, the United States, where all life seemed to live at harmony with its surroundings. Even in winter, the roadsides were places of beauty where countless birds came to feed. Yeah, there couldn't be, a more concise, condensed pastoral introduction. Again, we're looking back we're doing the same exact thing, really, that Theocritus does insofar as where is this pastoral place? Well, it's back in time a little, and we noted that it often coincides with like the childhood of the person writing about it, but it's also can be, as it was with Theocritus, not just back in time, the way Eden would have been back in time, but at a remote place. So pastoral, of course, is outside of the city and all, and here that's just it. It's rural America, so it's exactly pastoral, and it's displaced both temporally and spatially a generation or two in the past, way out in the rural area. And everything there seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. It's a perfect pastoral scene. Rural America, a generation or two before Carson, is depicted as a perfect locus hominis. And almost you saw with As You Like It, when the Duke's party is in the Forest of Arden, they know that something is different from the pastoral depictions coming out of the Mediterranean, that it's cold there and all. But even the winter is great. And the Duke says that, well, it's cold here, but that's really good because it makes me feel alive with my body and all. And Carson does the same thing. Even in winter, the roadsides were places of beauty where birds came to feed. So this is right out of Pastoral. It's the beginning of Silent Spring is a perfect locus hominis. It's an Eden-like place. But then, here's the serpent entering Eden. A strange blight crept over the area, and everything began to change. Everywhere was a shadow of death. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbird, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound, only silence. So, by the way, if you weren't quite sure what that title was about, here you are on page 2. She explains it. It used to be, this cacophony of birds singing all the time, and now there's silence. They have all died. By the way, why have they died? Because of DDT. If you've read it, you know. This biocide that's sprayed on insects, and we'll get into this in more detail in the next lecture with ecology, but this biocide that's spread on insects, well, birds eat the insects, they ingest the biocide. It turns out that DDT weakens the shells of birds. It specifically causes them reproductive harm. They even, can lay the egg, they sit on the eggs and they crack, and suddenly it's just decimating bird populations everywhere. And as a consequence, we have just this silent spring where there's no sound. But this could be right out of the biblical account, a strange blight crept over everything and began to change. Everywhere was the shadow of death. Well, what is one of the consequences of the fall for Adam and Eve? Well, of course, death is introduced into the world. Nothing died before the fall, but in the biblical account, this is why human beings die, and why everything dies. And most Christian theologians believe that had there not been a fall, everything would have continued to live on forever, would have had a mortal life, so that, animals and birds and all would have lived that way too, just the same way that they are imagined as living in heaven and being immortal. So that immortality was originally part of the earthly condition, not just the metaphysical one, but that changed. But Carson is right in that, right? Everywhere there was the shadow of death. It's just perfect because she sets up in that very first paragraph a wonderful, perfect pastoral scene. She's very specific. It's a generation or two ago in the United States in rural areas, and now death has crept in, that something has happened. So, if you read this like a whodunit, then the question you want to know is, at this point in the text, who did it? Who killed it? So the answer to the biblical account, well, it's the serpent who comes into Eden, and then Eve then becomes corrupted and does that thing to bring death into the world. Well, here we did something here to bring death to rural America, to America in general, the United States. But what is it? So, if you watch the opening of An Inconvenient Truth, the documentary by Al Gore, he does the same exact thing. So, and in that scene, you see a beautiful river, and it's a very rural area. It's like a semi-wilderness area. It might even be wilderness. It's clearly in the United States, and this is clearly not in any city. This is in a pastoral place outside of the city. And Al Gore, you see it and you hear it, and then you hear a voiceover, which is Gore's voice saying that, there had once been a time where all America, all the United States was like this, where it was this beautiful pastoral place, but something is threatening it now. So again, the serpent in Gore's retelling of that is what we've done to bring about climate change. That's what's causing the problem. So really what they're doing here in terms of what we've looked at, they're employing anti-pastoral in the sense that we're using it. So they want to get you thinking about a perfect pastoral place, a beautiful bucolic place, but then what they want to do is focusing right on the environmental devastation. So going back to Carson, by page 2, she's done with the pastoral. The pastoral, over-the-top descriptions of a perfect place, and will not be there anymore. And then for the rest of the work, she's going to focus on the devastation. Gore is going to do the same. They're going to focus on, the shift that has happened and why. Carson is because of introducing these chemicals, biocides, into the environment, and Gore, it's burning of fossil fuels and other activities that brought about the emission of greenhouse gases that are causing the climate crisis. So in that sense, Thoreau also inaugurates, or is a part of the inauguration of an environmental era. But Thoreau's era is a little different, right? So Thoreau, he's sort of over the top fetishizing the environment, right? Walden Pond is this beautiful pastoral place. That's all he wants to talk about. That's all he wants to focus on. Yeah, 15 miles north of him is Lowell, Massachusetts, the biggest industrial area in the country at the time. Yeah, Thoreau doesn't really talk about that at all. He mentions factory life, but the main focus is on the perfect pastoral setting. Gore and Carson, even though they introduce their works by talking about a perfect pastoral past, they're going to have a focus purely on the environmental devastation. So I mentioned, if you remember Ed Bertinsky, he does the same in his photographs, where he just looks at devastation of like strip mining and things like that. Yeah, so these writers then, these kind of modern environmentalists like Carson and Al Gore, are of interest to a whole new wave of eco-critics. What I meant by that is, up until the 1990s and through the 1990s in the 21st century, environmental critics, people doing what we're doing, often looked at works that celebrated the environment, looked at pastoral, loved to look at Thoreau and all. But, we often call them first wave environmental critics, and they sort of, like to believe in the romanticized view of nature and all. But a second group of environmental critics would be less interested in Thoreau and more interested in Carson, because they're more concerned about, environmental devastation and all. So, yeah, like Carson, they may look to overly romanticized views of nature, the way Carson does on page 1, but very quickly, the way the Carson and Gore will shift to look at sites of environmental devastation, the impact of human encroachment on the planet in a whole different range of ways. Eco-critics will then make that shift with them. It took a little while, because Carson was really like a harbinger of this 70 years ago, but eventually eco-critics will catch up. By the early 20th century, we'll begin looking at, sites of environmental devastation and texts that do the same. So where that translates into with environmental critics is that, let me see if I can pop back one here, is that for eco-critics now in the 21st century, in case you want to continue pursuing doing eco-criticism, the interest is far less on works like Thoreau's Walden, celebrations of nature, but rather on texts that deal with the problems we have, the environmental problems we have, whether it's things like biocides in the atmosphere, whether it's, a rapidly warming planet and all the climate changes that are happening as a result of it. All that is going to be the focus of eco-criticism. So eco-criticism sort of has made kind of a sea change, so to speak, in the last couple decades, and it's done it in a very big way. So just something to think about. So we're going to continue with Rachel Carson next time, and she will conclude our survey of Western thinking on an environmental eco-critical register. So that's it for next time. And until then, I'll see you then, and take care.